quick walkthrough. 57, Sputnik was launched, right? This kicked it all off. The first man-made satellite to orbit Earth. Then, in the late 60s, DARPA was created by the Pentagon. And then in 1993, Tim Berners-Lee creates the World Wide Web. And they forgot to mention it, but in 1994, I went online for the first time. But let's zoom out. What are the defining traits of our internet? I'm going to go through the evolutions of the web. Now, Web 1 was essentially about open decentralized protocol, such as email, web, right? Basic protocols for us all to be digitally connected. It was community governed, right? Early stage. This is actually what also Reddit is very much still based on, right? This governance principle. It had limited functionality. There was no value build up within the network. And most importantly, it was a revolutionary time. It was a time of free thinkers and rebels looking to change the way our system worked, how we governed ourselves. And so to share a little bit of that spirit with you here today, here is the declaration of an independent cyberspace as per John Barlow in 1996, who was one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
A declaration of the independence of cyberspace, as written by John Perry Barlow at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland on February 8th, 1996. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one, so I address you with no greater authority than that with which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours.
Well, that's pretty revolutionary, isn't it? So let's see how the spirit has fared since 1996, because today we are in Web 2. And our Web 2 is defined by siloed, centralized services such as Google, Facebook, and Twitter. It's corporation owned. It has advanced functionality, but not particularly broad functionality. And the value accrues and is built up towards the big tech companies in the world. And our use of the internet is actually reflecting that, right? In 2021, more than 50% of all internet traffic was created by these 6 companies. And even more so, 3 companies today are actually generating over a third of global web traffic. And on top of that, 5 companies, and those are technology companies, represent over 50% of the total NASDAQ 100 value, right? Interestingly, therefore, the wealth divide doesn't just happen on like the regular monetary level, it also happens in our financial markets. Right, 5% of these companies in the NASDAQ 100 represent 50% of the total value of the NASDAQ 100, which is insane if you think about it, right? On to Web3 then. And Web3 is characterized by decentralized blockchain, i.e. examples of that are Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano, right? They are community governed. They have advanced functionality, and the value is actually accrued within the network participants, i.e. if you are on that platform, you will be generating value. And the key here really is governance, because the internet, as opposed to the revolutionary spirit that we heard about earlier, has followed very much the same pattern of centralization and consolidation of power, like government, industry, and finance have over the last 50 years. And so this idea of the whole new internet thing is for us to actually take back that power. And the hype around Bitcoin and Ethereum, or even Dogecoin, if you will, are largely reflective of the seductive pool of speculation and self-enrichment. However, the underlying technology is potentially paradigm shifting because it allows users and networks to self-govern, to operate outside of a centralized system. And now I hear you think, why does this matter, dude? Well, let's take stock of something that happened about 10 years ago, right? When someone came out and said, I do not want to live in a world where everything I do and say is recorded. This is not something I am willing to support or live under. Any guesses who this was? Quick, just unmute yourself if you know. Interesting. So the first one was a terrorist. The other one is a persecuted journalist. We're moving into the right direction. But we're talking about Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden, working with one of the world's largest military industrial intelligence organizations, found something. Now, what did he find? He found that since 2007, every major technology company had been onboarded into an NSA program called PRISM. Now, what was PRISM? PRISM is a program by the NSA, as I mentioned, that allows for them to harvest everyone's data, from email to chat to video to photos to voice, file transfers, video conferences, everything. Which is pretty damning, right? If you did your pre-reads, you've seen Shoshana Zuboff's bit on surveillance capitalism. This is where that comes from, right? This is official government policy to spy on you. And this is not just an American problem, right? Like, the Europeans were aware of it and allowed for it to happen. Because just last year, we learned that the Danish intelligence officers or agencies were helping the NSA to spy on Angela Merkel, who happened to be the elected top representative of the German democracy. And so have we heard or seen any consequences from this? Have we seen changes in policy? Have we seen like major public uproar? All right, well, let's see what happened earlier last week. A subcommittee in the US House of Representatives was doing a hearing on the Twitter files, which is relating the relationship between the US White House and Twitter, as well as other social media platforms during the pandemic. Let's see what.
And almost 1 year since the first bombshell Twitter files. Looking back now, and my questions are for Mr. Taibbi and Mr. Schellenberger, what was the most alarming thing that you came across during your review of internal Twitter documents? And I have a number of follow-up questions, so keep it short.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think the most alarming thing that we saw was the regular stream, organized stream of communication between the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the largest tech companies in the country. They had an organized system for flagging content, not occasionally, but in enormous numbers, involving spreadsheets of accounts that ran to the hundreds and thousands. And this was shocking to us. And to the congressman's point, this isn't crazy conspiracy theory. We've already had 4 federal judges rule that they believe this activity violates the First Amendment. This is quite serious. We didn't know whether it was against the law, but we certainly thought it was shocking enough to be in the public interest. And that for me was the most serious.
All right. So let's reflect how this relates to our supposed system view, right? Because as we know, most of us are very comfortable in saying that we live in what is legally referred to as a constitutional democracy. But again, because I'm not particularly smart, I looked up what that actually means. So let's look at it, right? So it's around basic rights, honoring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, human and of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, etc. Okay, well, we can talk about how basic rights are being honored within our societies, but let's look on. Freedom of conscience and expression. I think the example I just shared makes it really fucking clear that we do not have the freedom of expression. Next to that, privacy and civil society. I think it's also pretty clear, with what we've seen from PRISM and the Snowden revelations, that privacy and civil society are not actually are really being honored. And then justice. So distributive justice, a fair distribution and the benefits of society. Have you seen any bankers go to jail after the 2009 crisis? I haven't personally, so I don't think that's really working. Corrective justice, fair and proper responses to wrongs and injuries, i.e., for instance, let's say, the top government official influencing the public debate by censoring people. I think that's also not really being discussed. Procedural justice, i.e., and this is an interesting one, use of fair procedures in the gathering of information. Again, PRISM. I don't think that's really working at the moment. Equality then, political equality, i.e., does everyone have the same right to say? Let's say, do we have a right to say who is the president of COP28, for instance? I don't think we do. And it seems that the people who are sitting on these vested interests have a lot more say in how we're moving the planet than we do, which seems to be a bit of a problem, because we should be having equality before the law. And that means that we're not being discriminated in any way, shape, or form. And I think that we're all fairly aware of the fact that that doesn't necessarily always happen. In the Netherlands, last year, there was the child benefits scandal, where literally the government unleashed an AI on people receiving welfare based on their ethnicity. I.e., if you were North African, you were going to be checked. That's a bit problematic, yeah. And then economic equality. I mean, I've just shown you the distribution of the last 3 years of money creation, and I think that's pretty fucking clear too. So lastly, openness, right? Constitutional democracies are based on a political philosophy of openness and a free marketplace of ideas. The availability of information through a free press. I remind you of Assange, who literally opened up war crimes by the American regime. Yes? Where is he now? Oh yeah, wait, he's in prison. Okay. So openness is also not really working, is it? Now, what are we going to do? And what does this mean for our future of the digital era? Because as I mentioned, we are moving to Web 3.0. And there's huge potential of decentralization, redistributing equity back into networks of participation, governed by community. And the crucial bit here is that we're moving away from posting to actually getting self-determination in relation to owning the content and data that we produce, as opposed to your content and creations being owned by the centralized platforms, selling your surfer or your influencer interests or your Tinder habits to the highest bidder 5 times a day. Because as the saying in the industry goes, and I've worked in this industry quite a bit, if you are not paying for the product, you are the product. And this is really clear when we start looking at the revenue numbers of these platforms that we use so often and share some of the most intimate of our thoughts and feelings. And this is changing with Web3. Because as we mentioned, the underlying technology enables us to free ourselves from the power that these organizations, from government to tech platform, have over us. Now, what does that mean for the future of a civic perspective within this digital era? So let's look at what the governments are saying. Well, the governments are saying that, hey, you need a digital ID. And this is one of the latest EU initiatives. It was essentially like rubber stamped for preparation a couple of weeks ago. And basically, the idea is to have a pan-European identity service that digitizes all of your access as a general sort of like identifier, right? It will go to your banking, it will go to your mortgage, it will go to your insurance, it will go to your healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fun fact is that the House of Representatives in the Netherlands, a couple of weeks before that vote, had voted on that matter in terms of what should the Netherlands do within the EU in terms of our relationship to this agreement. And the majority said, we don't want it. We don't want to be a part of that. Now, 2 weeks after that, the minister goes to Brussels and signs it anyway, right? And that's a bit problematic in my view. And I know that Sweden is very advanced in this digital identity, right? My question to you, however, is this. Would you trust Brussels with all this information? It is largely unelected. And there was probably a reason why Sweden, in this case, for instance, chose to keep the Svenska krona. Yeah. And these types of self-determination as a country, and sovereignty was a word that we heard earlier, that sovereignty is decreasingly possible, right? More and more policies are being made in the EU. And as a result, countries and citizens are increasingly dependent on what's happening in Brussels for policies and law. And another initiative you'll be hearing more about over the next couple of months and years is going to be explained now by the managing director of the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank in the US.
Central bank digital currency. Do you think that that is something that you all should be looking into seriously? To what degree should you be looking into it seriously? Just what are your thoughts on CBDC?
I mean, as my colleagues at the Federal Reserve have talked about, we are examining it. I'll tell you, my personal bias is I'm pretty skeptical. I keep asking anybody at the Fed or outside of the Fed to explain to me what problem this is solving. I can send anybody in this room $5 with Venmo right now. Right? No, seriously. So what is it that a CBDC could do that Venmo can't do? And all I get is a bunch of hand waving. I get a bunch, well, maybe it's better for financial inclusion. Maybe it's better for cross-border remittances. Maybe. Is there any evidence that it is? And, they say, well, what about China? China's doing it. Well, I can see why China would do it. If they want to monitor every one of your transactions, you could do that with the central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. If you want to impose negative interest rates, you could do that with the central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. And if you want to directly tax customer accounts, you could do that with the central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. So I get why China would be interested. Why would the American people be for that?
So that's in America. But in Europe, the EU's answer to the rise of digital currency, or the central bank digital currency as it's referred to more broadly, is the digital euro. And I promise you that both digital IDs and CBDCs will appear in the near future as options initially. And increasingly, these options will reduce. And increasingly, this will be a requirement for you to participate in society. And if you're somehow following this debate, you may have heard something about programmability. Now, what is programmability? It's the ability to predetermine what money can or cannot be used for. And the EU says, we'll never implement that. We'll never do that. Trust us. Don't worry about it. It's all good. Now, as we know, monetary policy is generally set by the World Bank and the IMF. So let's have a look at what the Deputy Director of the IMF, Kenji Okamura, has to say about programmability. And if you're not aware of what the IMF is, it is the International Monetary Fund, which has as its stated objective, and I quote, to achieve sustainable growth, again, and prosperity for all of its 190 member countries. One of its main functions is, together with the World Bank, to set global financing standards and policies. Now, what does Uncle Kenji have to say about programmability?
The third way we think CBDC can improve financial inclusion is through what we call programmability. That is, CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contracts, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized. For example, for food. So this potential programmability can help government agencies to precisely target their support to those people who need support.
And so that concludes part 3. Now, I have a question for you that I'd like you to think about over the next couple of days. Do you want the same organizations that are either straight up failing or consciously derailing climate talks, who've been printing money since the dawn of this system, with increasingly devastating effects on regular civilians, to determine what you can spend your money on? They've been spying on you to an extent that today we essentially live in a digital surveillance system, which is enabled by the technology platforms that all of us use for at least a minimum an hour a day on average. Does that sound like the world you want your children or your nieces or nephews or your kid next door to inherit? Because it feels to me like we're in a bit of a pickle.